here talking with Professor Mark Solms, who is in London at the moment, although he ordinarily hails from Cape Town, South Africa, where he is the director of neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute at the University of Cape Town. Is that correct? Right.
Correct.
All right. He is a psychoanalyst, but more specifically a neuropsychoanalyst who has spent his career exploring topics with profound relevance for psychoanalysts, including topics of emotion, consciousness, dreaming, and more. And many of us are familiar with his work on dreams and dreaming, and with the fascinating insights that he gleaned from working with brain damaged patients. But today, we've invited you, Mark, to discuss your latest book, published in 2021, entitled The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. By the way, Mark, I don't know if you know this, but every graduate this year of 2021 from the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute was given a copy of your book, commemoration of their achievements and hopefully pointing them in the proper direction. So
wonderful. I had no idea. That's great news.
Isn't that great? Yeah. Anyway, okay, so this book is extremely rich, extremely dense, has to be read many, many times over in order to be able to begin to process it. And today, I think, we're going to only get glimpses of the work because there's so much there. And so maybe when we begin, Mark, you can give us an overview of the book, but I have a personal request in that. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the title of the book, because I've been puzzling about the word spring. I think about spring as maybe a coil that stores and releases energy. Or I think of like a deep source of something like a spring water or a source of energy. Or then I think about spring as, like the season and the season of birth and rebirth. So I'm sure that you spend a long time thinking about the proper title, and I'd love to hear if you have if you can sneak in a few words about that when you tell us about the book. So I'll let you begin.
Amusingly, I must confess that the title was not of my choosing. I wanted to entitle it Consciousness Itself, and my editor said that's far too abstruse. Nobody will know what you mean by consciousness itself. And so we had a backwards and forwards conversation, and then we jointly hit upon this idea. In my mind, it was a spring in the sense of a water source. That was the image that I had in mind. And obviously the adjective hidden is that it's not an obvious water source. It's one that one finds. But I was rather pleased when I realized that some people took it to refer to a mechanical spring and therefore an energy source. It was not in my mind, but it's a very apt image for the way in which I conceive of consciousness. I think it is literally an energy source in the sense that it is affective. Consciousness is first and foremost in its foundational form feeling. Feelings represent ultimately our needs, and they are therefore demands for work. They are, in that very simple physical sense, an energy source. And so I was very pleased to realize that it had that meaning. As far as seasons are concerned, that also was not in my mind.
No, but then an idea like psychic energy, I mean, it takes us back to Freud, right?
Well, most psychoanalysts are embarrassed by the concept of psychic energy. What they overlook, however, is that nothing can be done in the physical universe without a source of energy. And I would like to remind them of Freud's definition of drive, which is a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. So if the mind does anything in natural scientific terms, it must be performing some sort of work. In other words, it's achieving something, it's doing something. It's not just there, sort of floating in the ether alongside everything else in nature and being the only part of nature that doesn't fit in with the rest of it. So that was Freud's deep ambition, to have a natural science of the mind. And so it's no accident that Freud used words like, it's a measure of the demand for work. It was very pointedly rooted in Freud's understanding of thermodynamics, and in the Helmholtz School of Medicine, Brücke, one of the members of that Berlin Physical Society, where Helmholtz contributed fundamentally to the formulation of the laws of thermodynamics. So, Freud was deeply steeped in all of this stuff. So to come back to the point, in my view, we're quite wrong to be embarrassed by the notion of a psychical energy. There must be a psychical energy. There must be some energy source that drives the work that the mind does. And it's exactly building on those foundations, my book. In a word, I believe that what Carl Friston calls variational free energy is the energy source that drives the work that the mind does. And that brings psychoanalysis right into the, not so much the mainstream as the cutting edge of theoretical neurobiology.
That's what's so exciting about it. It does. When you mention Helmholtz and the unconscious inference, right? That is the link to ultimately to Friston and you and this whole way of understanding how the mind works, right?
Yes, that's correct. Not only unconscious inference, which is a very direct link between Helmholtz and Friston, but actually even more fundamental than that, Helmholtz contributed to the formulation of the first law of thermodynamics, the law of the conservation of energy. And that's what we were talking about a moment ago. The law of conservation of energy says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be converted from one form into another, and transferred from one system to another. And the idea that energy can be converted from one form into another raises the question that we were discussing a minute ago. What form of energy drives the mind? And from what is it converted into what? And then what does it in turn get converted into? I know that this sounds like a terribly abstruse thing, but what it comes down to, Virginia, is the mind part of nature, or is it something else? If the mind is part of nature, then embarrassing as it may be, as I said a while back, we have to find a way of answering questions exactly like this. There must be a way in which we can reconcile the dynamics and mechanics of the mind with that of the rest of nature. And that was the mission of the Helmholtz, what's called the Helmholtz School of Medicine, which was actually formerly called the Berlin Physical Society.
Oh, really?
That was exactly their aim. Their teacher, Helmholtz and Brücke and Ludwig and Dubois-Raymond, their teacher was Johannes Müller. And Müller was the great champion of vitalism, the idea that there's some etat vital, some life force, something which distinguishes living things from the rest of nature. And it was an attempt to advance beyond that quaint notion that gave rise to the Berlin Physical Society, that they wanted to show that life was just part of nature, that it obeyed the same rules as everything else. And Freud took it one step further and tried to say, well, mental life is just part of nature and obeys the same rules as everything else.
That's fascinating. So did they rebel against their teacher in that sense?
They rebelled in the nicest possible way. They actually revered him, but they didn't agree with him.
How about that? Okay. All right. Well, tell us more about how your book evolves and unfolds, and maybe even.
Well, this
Well,
maybe even.
I was going to say maybe even something about. I mean, it's your story of how you personally came into this field with your own personal story, which I know that you begin the book with that as well, and that's very powerful.
Well, the subtitle of the book, the title is A Hidden Spring, as we were saying a moment ago. The subtitle is A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, and the emphasis here is on the word journey. The book is written as a kind of a not so much a travelogue as a sort of a scientific autobiography in some ways. It tells my own journey, literally, of how I came to the point of reaching the conclusions that I did in this book, which for that reason, I do consider it to be the culmination of my life's work, although, Virginia, I have every intention to carry on working a good few decades more to come. It begins, the book does, with the event that was probably the formative event of my whole life, but certainly was the formative event of my working life, which is that my brother, 2 and a bit years older than me, fell off the roof of a 3-story building and fell onto his head, onto the concrete pavement below, fractured his skull, and sustained an intracerebral hemorrhage, which required, I mean, he was flown to, we lived in a small village, and he was flown to Cape Town. Here, let me just say something on the side here. Absolutely remarkably, the Department of Neurosurgery at Groote Hospital at the University of Cape Town, where I now work, the very same building. Yeah. It's an absolutely remarkable coincidence. And we only moved into that building last year. It wasn't the building that I was in previously, and our department got moved back into the building that it was in those days in the 1960s. So my brother was cared for there, brought back home a few weeks later, survived obviously, and looked the same, but was not the same person. And it was deeply troubling. I mean, it was obviously very upsetting for all concerned. When I say it was the biggest event in my life, it was obviously the biggest in his, and probably in all of our lives in my family. But the thing that I'm focusing on is that the uncanny impression it made on me, that this chap was my brother, but he wasn't my brother. He looked like my brother, but he wasn't. He was somebody else. And where has my brother gone? And it got my little mind spinning. How can you change as a person as a result of damage to part of your body? And all sorts of other questions that flow from that. Ultimately, questions of mortality, because if this happens to him, it must apply to me. I too must be this. Somehow, my personality, is my brain. So I think actually we underestimate children. I think many, if not most children, at some point ponder these things. But I probably was confronted by them a little earlier and a little more kind of rudely than most.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as if I then sat down and decided, okay, I'm going to become a neuroscientist. But it clearly, one thing led to another. And it wasn't just that event, it was also from then onwards, my relationship with my brother had everything to do with his brain damage. For example, my academic success was always a source of great pain to him and to awkwardness in the household. So I think that I'll dwell on this because we're psychoanalysts and tell you that I think that my choice of profession, my original profession is neuropsychology. And I think, I say original before I became an analyst. And I think it was a compromise between, on the one hand, my ambition. I wanted to do well, but every time I did well, it showed up my brother and caused him pain. So I think it was a compromise between ambition on the one hand and guilt on the other. Because if I did well in this field, then I would be helping people like my brother. So, in this way, I could do well without being, what's the word, selfish or insensitive.
Well, it's a beautiful compromise. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course these things happen unconsciously. I mean, I didn't. It was only in my analysis, amazingly, that I joined all these dots and realized that that's obviously what I had done. But the point I'm leading up to come back to the journey, is that when I studied neuropsychology, which was in the early 1980s, it was a real shock to me to discover that we learned nothing about the mind in neuropsychology. What we learned about was the functions underlying things like perception and memory and language, and we were shown these flow charts, of how all the boxes and arrows, as to how these functions are put together. But there was nothing mental about them. It was no different in principle from how you might explain the functions of the heart or the lungs. So when I asked my professors, but where is the subject? The person that experiences all of this information, and they looked at me kind of condescendingly and said, advised me, you mustn't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career. And of course, what had motivated me was not a desire for a career. I really needed to understand, how does it happen that we are our brains, our sentient, subjective experiencing selves. So to cut a long story short, that is why I ended up training in psychoanalysis. It's because, looking around, the one branch of the mental sciences in which lived experience was actually taken seriously was psychoanalysis. And it was, I think I had a different sort of introduction to psychoanalysis from most of us because of my own professional background. It was via Freud's project that I was introduced to Freud's project for a scientific psychology. So I was amazed. I thought, because all, everyone knows Freud. Everyone in my field, knew Freud was not a proper scientist, and we were taught not to take this seriously at all. But when I read the project for a scientific psychology, I thought, my God, this is absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I had no idea that Freud was a neuroscientist. So it was, I immediately, upon becoming acquainted with Freud and psychoanalysis, I mean it, immediately in the 1980s, I saw my future. I thought, well, that's what I got to do. I've got to carry on doing what Freud was trying to do in the project. We can do this now. Freud abandoned it because he didn't have the methods, but by jolly, we've got the methods now. So So I trained in psychoanalysis and then did just that. I spent the rest of my working life trying to bring psychoanalysis into the neurosciences. In other words, to bring subjectivity to bring lived experience into neuropsychology in particular, and conversely to bring the knowledge that we have obtained in the neurosciences into psychoanalysis. So that's, sorry, I'm being very verbose. So that's the beginning of my book. Then I describe, my scientific journey studying brain mechanisms of dreaming, from the brain mechanisms of dreaming being led to brain mechanisms of emotion. Because it turns out, obviously dreams have everything to do with consciousness. That's what they are, state of consciousness interrupting the unconsciousness of sleep. And they're an intensely affective form of consciousness. So it's no surprise that as I unpicked the brain mechanisms of dreaming, so I was led to these topics of affect and consciousness, and via that to Jaak Panksepp. Dear late Jaak Panksepp, who had, after Freud, he was the next biggest influence in my life. So the book then describes, what I learned about how intimately bound up with consciousness is affect, how in fact the foundational form of consciousness is affect. Then I proceed to unpack the consequences. Because in our attempt to solve the riddle of consciousness in neuroscience, we are focused conventionally on vision. Vision has been taken as our model example, we've hit a brick wall. That's why we've got this thing called the hard problem. Trying to explain why seeing something feels like anything at all. Why is there something it is like to experience, for example, color, when in fact you can process visual information perfectly well without having any experience. Your camera does it. In fact, the camera that's connecting you and me together now is seeing, but it's not conscious. Right. So why do we have to be conscious to see? And the same applies to all of cognition. It goes on perfectly well without consciousness. So the implications of shifting to affect are profound, because feelings, you can't have a feeling without feeling it. You can see without consciously seeing, but you can't feel without consciously feeling. And so I'm just alluding to the implications for the hard problem. Once we reformulate consciousness not as vision or anything exteroceptive or cognitive, it has profound implications. So the book goes through those. Let's look at what the mechanism then is of feeling, because the hard problem, the essence of it is that you can understand the mechanism of vision. It won't explain why there's something it's like to see. So I then go into the mechanism of affect to address this question. Does it explain why there's something it is like to feel? And that takes us into an attempt to bring feeling into the natural sciences. So there's a little bit of physics at that point, back to the thermodynamics we were talking about earlier. And then I end with a reconsideration of cognition in the light of if cognition is secondary to affect, then how do we reconceptualize cognition? And then it ends, believe it or not, well, because you've read the book, it ends with the question, if we really now do have a formal, mechanistic, natural, scientific account of how consciousness is caused, then we should be able to engineer it. That's the ultimate test of the theory. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said, in fact, it was written on his blackboard when he died, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. So for me, that's actually the main thing I'm doing right now. That's why I'm in London, is I'm here consulting with my colleague Carl Friston, who's the third great influence on my working life after Freud and Panksepp. We're trying to make a robotic consciousness in the sense that it has simple feelings. It knows and feels its own dwindling energy supplies and so on.
That's yeah. I wanted to ask you about that because you were working with people in artificial intelligence and trying to develop that. That's wow, mind-boggling. You know.
Yeah, who would have thought? I mean, it's the last place I would have expected to find myself at this stage of life.
Really, really. But okay, so I can ask. I have this opportunity to ask you my question, which is so. When you talk about vision, and that one can have blind sight and can see even though one is not conscious of seeing, and we're probably not conscious of seeing a lot. But what does make us conscious of, or what does give us a perception that when we're seeing? How can you talk about that?
Well, the crucial issue in terms of conscious seeing and conscious experience of any kind, in my view, I mean, when I say the crucial issue, it's not as if it's a done deal and now it's all solved. In my view, the crucial thing is choice. That if you have an algorithmic decision-making process where everything just sort of like chugs along, and you put in situation A, B, C, D, E, comes out solution F, G, H, I, J. There's no choice involved. If you're in a state of uncertainty, in other words, if you're in an unpredicted or novel environment, you can't do that. You can't have an algorithm that tells you what to do in a situation that you've never found yourself in before. You have to generate a new solution, and that's what we mean by choice. You're faced by alternatives. Which one is better? Do I do this or do I do that? And remember, Virginia, we're talking about living organisms here. Who are faced by choices which have life and death consequences. So this is not an academic exercise. I wonder which of these, shall I jump off the cliff or shall I not? Has big consequences. So the basis of choice is a value system. It has to be. There has to be something that's better and something that's worse. And ultimately, for us living things, that value system is rooted in what I just said, life versus death. It's good to survive, and it's bad not to. So our feelings are how, across the multiple parameters which determine our viable bounds, each one of those vital needs, and I include in those vital needs emotional needs, but we can come to that. The way that we know how we're doing is feeling. Unpleasant feelings of their various kinds tell you you're moving away from where you need to be. Pleasant feelings mean that you're moving back to where you need to be, and that's the basis of choice. So if you do something in an uncertain situation, the feeling, like for example, you're in a carbon dioxide filled room. This is a novel situation. You don't know which way to turn. Your breathing, your air hunger will decrease if you head to where the oxygen is. So it feels better. And conversely, if you go to diminish, if your choice leads you to diminishing oxygen, you feel more suffocation along. So the feeling tells you how you're doing. That's what it's there for. Now, you asked about vision. So you have, first of all, that's what feeling is. Feeling, it attributes value to the organism, for the organism, on the basis of which it makes choices. Choices about what? Choices about that. It's like, I feel like this about that. So we feel our way into our cognitions and actions. We feel our way into our representation of and action in the world, so as to make our choices there. So feeling is extended onto representation.
Mhm.
So it's in a nutshell, and I want to add one further detail, but in a nutshell, cognition is intrinsically unconscious, goes on all the time unconsciously until we need to make choices. In other words, when there's uncertainty, and then we feel our way into our cognitions, and in this way, it then becomes something it is like to have cognitive experience. The thing I needed to add, though, is that it's not the same as affect. Remember what I said at the very beginning, quoting Freud. I said that drive is a measure of the demand for work
Yeah.
made upon the mind. This is the work itself. It's not the demand for work. Affect is a demand for work. Cognition is the work. And this goes back again to thermodynamics, if I can just quickly allude to it. Free energy is wasted energy in the sense that it's the energy in a system that is not currently being employed in effective work. It's free in that sense that it's free to be employed in effective work. Bound energy, anybody who knows their Freud will recognize these terms, is the converse of free energy. So cognition is bound energy. It is the stabilization and the utilization of feeling in the process of cognitive work. It's not just as Freud called it, the discharge function.
Well, is cognition binding energy or bound energy?
It's interesting you put it that way, because you must remember that after you've done conscious cognitive work, you then lay down a memory trace. I'm using Freudian terminology deliberately. And to use our modern terminology, you've laid down a prediction. In other words, memories are about the past, but they're for the future. The whole purpose of learning from experience is to predict on the basis of what happened last time, what shall I do next time? Once you've laid down a prediction, it's unconscious again. It's the vast bulk of our long-term memory systems operate unconsciously. And this is why cognition is intrinsically unconscious. So as long as those predictions service us, in other words, they lead to the outcomes that are predicted, then there's no uncertainty, and there's no need to feel your way through the problem once more. So when you say, is it in the present or the past tense?
Yeah.
It has everything to do with that. Cognition, so the binding of free energy is the work. It is predictive work in progress. And then, in other words, it's feeling your way through an uncertain situation. And this, by the way, in physiological terms, is what we call reconsolidation. So it's a prediction or a set of memory traces which goes on unconsciously. They are the synaptic weightings are set, and then it leads not to the predicted outcome. That prediction now becomes salient. It becomes uncertain, and it's up for revision. And that's what reconsolidation is, which is conscious cognition. Once the predictive work is done, then you lay down a new trace, and as long as it works, you don't need to become conscious of it again. So that you can see how these things have everything to do with our old meta-psychology.
Yes, and your book is beautiful in how it describes the multiple levels of predictions that starting at sort of core basic predictions and working out to more abstract predictions. So it's not just one prediction, there's a whole series of predictions, and it's hard to put your mind around in a way. But
what you've just said is very important. There's a hierarchy of predictions, and it's very important in relation to the very point we were just discussing, precisely because the most of what we do carries on unconsciously. You have to have a hierarchy. It has to be, okay, well, at this level things are uncertain, and these ones are we feeling, everything else, and it has to do with degrees of certainty, degrees of confidence in your predictions. So as you go deeper into the hierarchy of predictions, So you go into what we nowadays call non-declarative memory systems, which is just the same thing as what we in psychoanalysis call unconscious, the unconscious. These are predictions, that is to say, expectations of what will happen if we do X, Y, or Z. And these are not remembered, they're not thought, they're just enacted. And then we go deeper than that into our reflexes and instincts, which are absolutely not up for grabs. You can't change your reflexes. Those predictions, the prediction that, if I fire this autonomic reflex, I will return to my viable cardiological or thermoregulatory bounds. Those predictions have to always be certain. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Well, I have two different questions now that spring to mind, but maybe, well, the first one has to do with the term free energy. I think that a lot of us struggle with that. When you have used it in the realm of affect as free energy being say unregulated affect, something like that made a lot of sense, but that's not the free energy necessarily that Carl Friston is talking about. He's talking about more of a mathematical something or other, something, I don't know.
Well, you must remember when I first met Carl Friston, he was like just about everybody else in cognitive neuroscience. He didn't think much about affect. So this is for psychoanalysts, it's a shocker to realize just how disembodied and how Dr. Spock-like, is the brain that our cognitive colleagues
Mr. Spock.
envision.
Mr. Spock.
Mr. Spock, sorry. So Friston has shifted a great deal in his understanding. In fact, he's just written a commentary on my book in which he says that the most obvious thing about free energy is that it has a valence. It has a goodness and a badness. The free energy principle is basically you must minimize free energy. In other words, free energy is bad. I mean, what could be simpler than that? It's he hadn't construed it that way in the past. But when you say his way of thinking is mathematical, you must remember where we began in our conversation, Virginia, when we spoke about the Helmholtz school and all of that. It was Freud's great ambition in the project that it must be possible to bring the subjective life of the mind into quantifiable natural science. So the fact that there are ultimately laws which govern the behavior of this part of nature that we call the mind is exactly what we should expect to find. So we need somebody like Carl Friston to help us formulate those laws in formal mathematical equations. Free energy, they're different. Depends which discipline you're in. There's thermodynamic free energy, which is called Helmholtz free energy. And then in chemistry, we speak of Gibbs free energy. And in information science, we speak of Friston free energy. So the free energy, and they all, by the way, are formally equivalent to each other. It just depends on whether you're talking.
Yeah, there's something in the brain that is free energy, right? I mean, there's some I don't know, activations or something that represents free energy or is free energy.
Yes, so the brain is obviously a thermodynamic and a chemical system, but it is also an information processing system. So in thermodynamics, we're speaking about heat exchanges, temperature, heat and temperature exchanges between the system and its environment, chemical exchanges in chemistry, and in our field, we're talking about information exchanges. So So what, and they all related to each other because, you know, obviously what the brain does in terms of its information processing has consequences for its thermodynamics and its chemistry. So to come to the heart of the matter, in information science, what free energy is well, let me just first of all say what in every science what free energy is. There's a total amount of energy in the system, and some of it is being used in effective work and some of it is not. So the energy that is being used for effective work is the bound energy. The energy that is not being used in effective work is the free energy. So it's a measure of inefficiency. So clearly, for any system, it's a bad thing to be inefficient.
Right.
In information science, that has to do with information inefficiency. And at its heart is prediction. So predictions that work are efficient. Predictions that don't work are inefficient.
Well, that's why you say that the goal of the brain is to become unconscious, right? Or
yes.
Right.
Yes. The goal is to not be uncertain, to not have to. I mean, as alarming as it is to us conscious creatures, the design principle is, you know, you don't want to have problems that you need to feel your way through. In fact, this is what Freud called the nirvana principle, although, you know, I don't quite agree with the way in which he the way he formulated it. He was saying there's something beyond the pleasure principle, that we don't want to be troubled by all this, you know, demand for work. We want to just, you know, run along automatically. And be unperturbed by all of life's troubles. And so I agree that that's what we're trying to do, and that is an automaton. That is a system with no free energy. It's a system that just knows exactly what to do. There's a line from a Talking Heads song, which goes, it's wonderful. It goes, it's called Heaven, and the line goes, "Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens."
Okay.
And that's what we're aspiring to. We must be careful of what we wish for.
Okay, so I have a question. What does all of this work imply for the concept of an unconscious fantasy?
Yeah, sure. In fact, Virginia, I just realized there's one thing I didn't say a minute ago when you spoke about, you know, affect, and then you said Fristonian free energy doesn't seem to relate to that. I just want to finish that point, which is that to the extent that you have efficient predictions, to that extent you do not suffer affect. That's the point. So free energy, you know, inefficient predictions leads you to problems. That's where affects come from. Affects are demands for work. It's announcing, you know, shit isn't working. So that's where affect comes into the whole equation.
How does it come in there? Is that the decision triangle? How does that the midbrain distinct?
Yes, so mechanically, so you can, I mean, quantifiably, it just is increasing free energy, or increasing expected free energy is a better way of putting it, because this is a prediction machine that we're talking about. So the machinery in the brain in where this happens is the periaqueductal gray in the midbrain. It's a little, you know, a little structure this long, where all of our different need system, when I say needs, I mean homeostatic error signals. All of the error signals converge on the periaqueductal gray, and there. And the periaqueductal gray is adjacent to what's called the tectum, which contains the superior colliculi. And this is a concentrated sort of map of where things stand now. So the periaqueductal gray and the superior colliculi, it's needs and opportunities. And a calculation is made in terms of where the most salient salience is formally defined as the greatest opportunity for reducing my free energy. Their selection is made as to which need is going to be prioritized, and that is affect. Affect is the feeling of a salient need. And so that's where that all works. And the felt need is the demand for work, which then gives rise to the rendering salient of the predictions that are the uncertain predictions. Let us not forget, because that's where the free energy is. It's with the uncertain predictions. So that's how all of that works. But now,
did you want to say a word about homeostasis? I mean, I know you've been talking about it all along, but
yeah, it's implicit in what I've said. So homeostasis has to do with when I spoke of the second law of thermodynamics earlier, I mentioned the first more than the second, but the second is actually the crucial one when it comes to homeostasis. The second law of thermodynamics says that in any natural process, entropy will increase. In other words, the system will tend to a disordered state, to dissipation. We living things, unlike anything else in nature, we resist dissipation. We do not. We seek to prevent the second law of thermodynamics from allowing us to just disappear, in effect, ultimately, because if we lose our order, we lose our structured existence. And so the living things resist entropy. And the mechanism whereby we do it, all living things, is homeostasis. Homeostasis, we have viable bounds, like, for example, blood gas balance or core body temperature. This is where you need to be. Deviations from it are demands for work. That is, homeostasis is, when there's a deviation from a viable bound, then you perform work to get back. So for example, you're too hot. That's a deviation from where you need to be. You perspire and you pant. That gets you back. So that's how homeostasis works. Feeling is an extended form of homeostasis. As I said earlier, deviations from where you need to be feel bad, and returning to where you need to be feels good. It tells you how you're doing, and that adds the capacity for choice, which is, so, it's not just a simple homeostat which always does the same thing. It's a homeostat which adjusts on the hoof, so that you can feel your way through uncertain situations. That's how feeling extends this very basic principle of life, which is homeostasis. But I must say, just in case anybody gets the wrong end of the stick, in the end, the second law wins. we resist entropy for as long as we can, but
ducks to dust, right? Yeah. But
you asked about unconscious fantasy.
yeah, I did.
So unconscious fantasy is that these predictions. When I say that the drives make demands on the mind to perform work, that work is predictive work. What Freud called the ego job is to formulate predictions as to how to meet the demands of the id. And those predictions are of two kinds. There are those which are what we nowadays call declarative, in other words, that they can be brought back into consciousness. They are subject to review in consciousness, reconsolidation through revising the prediction. And then there are those which we call non-declarative. These are predictions which run automatically. They don't come back to mind. It's what Freud, the distinction between declarative and non-declarative memory is exactly the same as pre-conscious versus unconscious. Unconscious predictions, you don't remember them, you enact them, you repeat them, you just do them. And so unconscious fantasy is, before I use the word fantasy, let me just point out, the unconscious predictions are things which are not in the nature of thought processes. They are, you can't think them, you can only enact them.
Mhm.
Fantasy is a translation of those predictions into the language of thought processes. So it's a matter of, if I were to put this in words, this action, this expectation, this prediction that I'm enacting, if I were to turn it into a thought, it would be something like this. If things go, if I get into a crisis, mummy will pay attention to me. That's the thought process that then gets automatized. That whenever the child finds itself in a state of separation, distress, it gets itself into a pickle, has a crisis, gets sick, bangs its head or whatever, and then mummy comes. It's not in the nature of a thought. It's now something that the child just does. But if you translate that action into words or images, it would be a statement of the kind that I just described. If I hurt myself, mummy will come.
Well, that's
Now
what
you might think that that's a radical. You might think that's a radical revision of our concept of unconscious fantasy. But if you read, the seminal paper on unconscious fantasy is Susan Isaacs, The Nature and Function of Fantasy. And there she says exactly what I've just said, that it's a translation. The unconscious fantasy isn't actually a movie going on in your head. If you were to translate it into the language of adult, propositional cognition, then it would be like a story, of the kind that I've just spoken. The unconscious is unconscious. It doesn't work like our representational thought processes do.
But our history has been such that the idea would be through psychoanalysis, one could access an unconscious fantasy. But you're saying something different, which is that what we will do is to translate a repetition compulsion or something that is operating unconsciously. Will translate that into words, but it doesn't, that's not how it in operating.
The value of doing what we're doing now, in other words, reconceptualizing into the terms of contemporary science, these truisms that we've kind of stumbled upon during a century of psychoanalysis. It really is helpful to speak more precisely, because what we actually do, if you think about it, what we actually do is we interpret the transference. In other words, we look at what the patient is doing and draw it to their attention. It's the repetition. Freud's remembering, repeating, and working through is all about this. So it's in what the patient does that we reconstruct the unconscious fantasy lying behind their behaviors, and we draw the patient's attention to what they're doing here and now, and understand it through the lens of the past. But ultimately, it is exactly as I just formulated it when I said that the unconscious predictions, the non-declarative predictions, are not remembered but enacted, and that it's the enactment that we bring to the patient's attention and problematize, if I can use my way of speaking. In other words, that can be thought about, that can be rendered conscious, because there it is, the patient's doing it here and now. It's not the generator of the behavior. In other words, the unconscious prediction itself is not available for thought, but its consequences, what Freud would call its derivative, that is available for thought, and that's where the change comes. The making our patients aware that they're doing something which is meant to achieve some goal, and it ain't achieving it. So why are you carrying on doing that then?
Well, the beauty of your work, if you ask me, is the internal consistency of the whole thing from top to bottom, and the way that it then really guides treatment and guides how we help patients. I think that's remarkable. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful
Well,
thing.
thank you. I'm very glad to have such high praise coming from you. But the fact is that applies to any science, of course. It's the measure of its value is its usefulness. Unless you can do something with it, then well, it's all very interesting. But what's
Yeah.
the point?
Well, we've been talking probably too long, but just one final question to ask you. Can you tell us what you're going to do next?
Well, I know it doesn't win me friends, I'm afraid. The main thing I'm doing at the moment is working on this artificial consciousness project. So scientifically, that's the main thing I'm doing. So in terms of what am I going to do next, that's what I'm doing right now. What I'm also doing right now is finishing the revised standard edition of Freud, and that will be out. Believe it or not, this time it's really true. It will be out. Next year. It's on the shelves.
How exciting!
I'll then be working on Freud's neuroscientific works, which will not be out next year. That's an additional 4 volumes. And then I'm writing a book which is exactly along the lines of what you were talking about a minute ago, in terms of the practical implications of all of this deeply theoretical neuroscience, the practical implications for us users of that instrument of the mind. It's my provisional title is Our Patients Suffer Mainly from Feelings.
Our patients are what? Are what?
Suffer mainly from feelings, or what might be we suffer mainly from feelings.
Okay, all right. Wonderful, wonderful. I can hardly wait. Really, that's very exciting. Well, okay. Well, I am, thank you so much for talking with me and talking with all the people who are going to be listening to this and watching it. It's really great. And I wish you well, and that I hope that you get out of quarantine soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Virginia, for staying up late in order to, in Chicago, in order to talk to me early in London. I want to show our audience what I'm wearing, my University of Chicago t-shirt. And don't forget, I'm honorary faculty at
I was going to say, I forgot to mention that. You were on our faculty, yes.
Yes, I'm very proud to be so.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Virginia.
Good night.
Good night, bye-bye. Thank you.